cold wind whispered through the dimly lit streets as young Malik Washington ran home, his laughter echoing under the glow of flickering streetlights. His best friend, a golden retriever named Duke, bounded alongside him, his tail wagging with excitement. The world felt simple in these moments. Just a boy and his dog, racing against the wind. But Malik had no idea that before the night ended, his entire life would change. Before we dive into this gripping story, take a moment to like, share, and subscribe. You won't want to miss what happens next, because when one mistake ignites a firestorm, the truth has a way of coming out. Malik's house sat at the end of Sycamore Street, a quiet neighborhood where everyone knew each other's names. His father, Agent David Washington, worked long hours for the FBI. But tonight, Malik didn't mind being home alone. He had Duke, and that was all the company he needed. He tossed a tennis ball across the yard, watching as Duke sprinted after it with boundless energy. The dog had been a gift from his father on his 8th birthday, a promise that no matter how busy work got, Malik would always have a friend by his side. Malik had just picked up the ball when he noticed a police cruiser rolling down the street, its headlights cutting through the darkness. He didn't think much of it. Cops patrolled the area often. But as the car slowed in front of his house, a strange unease settled in his chest. The door creaked open, and Officer Grant stepped out, his hand resting on his holster. He was new to the neighborhood, a young cop with something to prove. His eyes locked onto Malik. "You live here?" the officer asked, his voice sharp. Malik hesitated. "Yeah, I do." Officer Grant's gaze flicked to Duke, who stood protectively in front of Malik. His ears perked up. "That your dog?" Malik nodded. "Yeah, he's mine. He won't hurt you." But something about the officer's expression made Malik nervous. His grip on the leash tightened. Grant took a step forward. "Leash laws say dogs gotta be tied up outside. You sure he's not aggressive?" "He's not," Malik insisted. "He's just playing." Then it happened. Duke barked, sensing the tension in the air. His tail wagged, but to Officer Grant, it must have looked like something else. A sudden, deafening crack shattered the quiet night. Malik froze, his ears ringing as Duke let out a yelp and collapsed onto the ground. The golden retriever whimpered, his body twitching against the pavement. Blood pooled beneath him, staining the sidewalk. "No!" Malik screamed, dropping to his knees beside his best friend. His hands trembled as he tried to comfort Duke, but the dog's breathing was shallow, his brown eyes filled with pain. Officer Grant stood frozen, his gun still raised, his face pale. He lunged at me," he stammered, but even he didn't sound convinced. Malik's entire body shook with rage and grief. "You shot my dog." His voice cracked, tears spilling down his face. A porch light flicked on across the street, and a few neighbors peeked through their windows, but no one stepped outside. They knew better than to get involved. Malik fumbled for his phone with shaky hands, dialing the one number that had always meant safety. "Dad," he choked out as soon as the call connected. Agent David Washington had spent years staring danger in the face, but nothing prepared him for the words he heard next. "They shot Duke," Malik sobbed. "A cop shot Duke." There was silence on the other end. Then, in a voice colder than steel, his father said, "I'm on my way." The call ended. Officer Grant took a step back, his confidence crumbling. "Listen, kid, it was just a dog." Malik's eyes burned as he shot to his feet. "He wasn't just a dog. He was my best friend." Grant opened his mouth to respond, but the distant sound of an engine roaring down the street made him pause. Headlights sliced through the night, moving fast. Then the black SUV skidded to a stop, and when Agent Washington stepped out, the air around him turned ice cold. Agent David Washington stepped out of the black SUV, his broad shoulders tense, his sharp eyes scanning the scene like a predator locking onto its target. The moment he saw his son kneeling beside Duke's still body, blood soaking the pavement, something inside him snapped. The street fell into a suffocating silence. Even Officer Grant, who had seemed so sure of himself just moments ago, swallowed hard as the towering man in a crisp suit advanced toward him. "Before we continue, make sure to like, share, and subscribe, because what happens next will change everything. Malik stood, his fists clenched, his face streaked with tears. Dad, he shot Duke. He didn't do anything, and he shot him. David's jaw tightened. He turned his gaze to Officer Grant, his expression unreadable. But Malik knew that look. It was the same look his father had when interrogating criminals. Calm on the surface, but underneath, a storm was brewing. Grant straightened, his fingers twitching near his holster. Sir, I was just doing my job. The dog was off the leash and it was aggressive. I had no choice. David took a slow, deliberate step forward. His presence alone made Grant flinch. You had no choice? His voice was quiet, controlled. But there was something dangerous beneath it. Grant cleared his throat. It barked. It could have attacked. That was my son's dog, David interrupted, his voice turning sharp. And you pulled the trigger without a second thought. You saw a black kid and a barking dog, and your first instinct was to shoot. Grant's face turned red. That's not what happened. David pulled out his phone. Let's find out. He turned the screen toward Grant, hitting play. A grainy security camera feed filled the screen, footage from David's own home surveillance system, and it showed everything. Duke standing calmly beside Malik. The officer stepping out of the car. Malik talking, his body language relaxed. And then Duke wagging his tail, barking once, before Grant unholstered his gun and fired. There was no aggression, no threat, just an overzealous cop who had made a deadly mistake. Grant paled. Wait, David's voice cut through the night like a blade. Did that dog look aggressive to you? The silence was deafening. Grant opened his mouth, but no words came out. His hands twitched at his sides, his eyes darting around like he was searching for an escape. Malik's chest heaved. You lied, he whispered. You shot Duke for nothing. David turned to his son. Get inside the house. Malik hesitated. But now, something in his father's tone told him not to argue. With one last look at Duke's lifeless body, Malik swallowed back his tears and hurried inside. As soon as the front door shut, David turned back to Grant. The cold fury in his eyes was unmistakable. I'm FBI, Officer Grant. That means I know the law better than you do. And right now, you're standing in the middle of a crime scene. Grant took a step back. A crime scene? It was a dog. David didn't blink. That dog was my son's property. You discharged your weapon without just cause on private property. That's reckless endangerment. That's destruction of property. That's excessive force. Grant swallowed. Look, we can talk about this. We're past talking. David's voice was low, lethal. You want to play tough guy with a kid? Let's see how you handle a federal investigation. The weight of those words settled over Grant like a crushing force. He started to stammer, to backtrack, but it was too late. David pulled out his badge and his phone at the same time. This is Agent Washington, he said into the receiver. I need internal affairs at my residence. Now. Grant's breath hitched. Wait. David's expression was ice. I suggest you don't say another word. Anything you say can and will be used against you. The flashing red and blue lights appeared in the distance. But this time, they weren't here for Malik. They were here for the cop who pulled the trigger. The flashing red and blue lights bounced off the houses on Sycamore Street, painting the pavement in streaks of color. More police cars rolled in, tires crunching against the asphalt. But this time, Officer Grant wasn't the one calling the shots. Inside the house, Malik stood at the window, his fingers gripping the curtain as he watched everything unfold. His heart pounded. Duke's body still lay on the sidewalk, a dark stain spreading beneath him. It didn't seem real. One moment, Duke had been running beside him, full of life. The next, he was gone. Before we continue, take a moment to like, share, and subscribe, because what happens next will shake this entire department to its core. Outside, Agent David Washington stood tall, his face unreadable as the first officer approached. Lieutenant Harris, a veteran in the force, older, wiser, and not one to take reckless actions lightly. Agent Washington, Harris greeted, his sharp eyes shifting to Grant. What the hell's going on here? David kept his tone measured, but there was steel underneath. We have a problem, Lieutenant. This officer discharged his weapon on my property, killed my son's dog without cause, and then lied about it. Harris turned to Grant, his jaw tightening. Is this true? Grant shifted on his feet, sweat beading on his forehead. Sir, David didn't give him a chance to spin another lie. He simply held up his phone, the security footage playing once again. The moment the shot rang out, Harris exhaled sharply. He rubbed a hand down his face, then looked at Grant like he was staring at a man digging his own grave. Jesus Christ. Harris turned to David. I take it you've already contacted Internal Affairs? David nodded. They're on their way. Grant's face drained of color. Wait, this is getting out of hand. It was just a... Finish that sentence, David interrupted, his voice low. Say it was just a dog. Say it out loud and see how that holds up in court. Grant snapped his mouth shut. He looked around like he expected someone to back him up, but the other officers were silent. No one wanted to be on the wrong side of this. Harris shook his head in disappointment. Grant, hand over your weapon. Grant's eyes widened. Sir, now. With a stiff jaw, Grant unholstered his gun and handed it over. Harris took it, locking eyes with him. Until Internal Affairs clears this, you're off duty. Badge and ID too. Grant hesitated. His fingers twitched as if he wanted to resist, but one look at David, at the man who had built his career on exposing corruption, told him it was pointless. With stiff movements, he unclipped his badge and handed it over. David turned to Harris. That's not enough. Harris sighed. Look, I understand you're upset. No, David cut him off. This isn't about me being upset. This is about accountability. If that bullet had hit my son instead of his dog, we'd be having a very different conversation right now. And you know it. Harris stiffened. The weight of David's words settled over everyone. The officers nearby shifted uncomfortably, knowing full well how different this could have gone. David's voice was razor-sharp. I want a full investigation, a psychological evaluation, body cam footage review, everything. Harris nodded. You'll have it. The sound of a car door slamming made everyone turn. A sleek black sedan pulled up, and two men in suits stepped out, Internal Affairs. They moved with a quiet authority, their eyes scanning the scene like they were already piecing the story together. Grant swallowed hard. David folded his arms. Let's see how well your story holds up under federal scrutiny. Grant opened his mouth as if to argue, but before he could speak, one of the IA agents said, Officer Grant, you're coming with us. Grant stiffened. Am I being arrested? Not yet, the agent replied. But let's just say you'll want a lawyer. The street was silent as they escorted Grant to the car. He didn't resist, didn't say another word. From the window, Malik watched as the man who shot Duke was driven away. It didn't bring Duke back. It didn't erase the pain. But as the taillights disappeared into the night, Malik felt something shift. For the first time since the gunshot rang out, he felt like justice was coming. The weight of the night still hung heavy in the air. The police cars had begun to clear out, but the damage had already been done. Duke's lifeless body remained on the sidewalk, a painful reminder of everything Malik had lost. He felt numb, like the world had been knocked off balance, and nothing would ever be the same again. Inside the house, Agent David Washington stood by the kitchen counter, his jaw clenched, his hands pressed against the surface. He had seen countless injustices in his career, but this was personal. Before we continue, make sure to like, share, and subscribe, because the fight isn't over yet. What happens next will shake the entire system. A knock at the door made Malik flinch. He turned his head just as his father stepped forward, unlocking it and swinging it open. Lieutenant Harris stood on the other side, his face lined with exhaustion. Behind him, two officers carried a black body bag toward Duke's resting place. Malik's breath caught in his throat, his hands clenched into fists. No, David turned sharply. What do you mean? No? Malik shook his head. They're not taking him like that. Duke wasn't some stray. He wasn't roadkill. He was family. Harris exhaled. I understand, son. But we have to process. No, you don't, David interrupted. His voice was firm, commanding. I'll handle Duke. My family will handle him with the respect he deserves. Harris hesitated, then nodded. He signaled to the officers who stepped back. Malik rushed outside, dropping to his knees beside Duke. His fingers trembled as he brushed over the dog's soft fur. The warmth was already fading. I got you, boy, he whispered. I got you. A soft hand rested on his shoulder. He turned to see his father kneeling beside him. We're gonna do this right, David said quietly. Tears welled in Malik's eyes, but he nodded. Together, they gently wrapped Duke in a blanket, lifting him with care. Not as evidence, not as a casualty, but as a loved one being brought home. As they carried Duke inside, Harris sighed and ran a hand down his face. This is a damn mess. David didn't look at him. No, this is a damn wake-up call. The words hung in the air. Harris shifted. Internal Affairs is handling Grant. But you and I both know how these things go. David's eyes darkened. That's why I'm making sure it doesn't go anywhere. Harris frowned. What do you mean? David pulled out his phone. Grant didn't just make a bad call. He panicked. He saw my black son with a dog and pulled the trigger. That's more than recklessness. That's bias. And I'm making sure everyone sees it. He tapped the screen and turned it toward Harris. The security footage was already uploaded. But not just to Internal Affairs. Not just to the department. To the public. A video titled Cop Shoots Black Boy's Dog, without cause, was already gaining views. Comments flooded in. Outrage. Grief. People demanding justice. Harris stiffened. Washington. Do you know what kind of storm you just kicked up? David met his gaze. A necessary one. Harris exhaled sharply. Damn it. He rubbed his temples but didn't argue. Instead, he pulled out his radio. Get me the commissioner, he ordered. Now. The weight of the moment settled in. This wasn't just another case. This wasn't going to be swept under the rug. Malik sat by Duke's side inside the house, silent, his heart heavy. He didn't know what would happen next. But as he glanced at his father, at the way he refused to back down, he knew one thing for sure. This wasn't over. It was just beginning. The next morning, the world had changed. Malik woke up to the sound of his father's phone buzzing nonstop. The air in the house was thick with tension, but also something new, momentum. He climbed out of bed, dragging his feet toward the living room, where David sat at the kitchen table, phone in hand, eyes locked on the screen. Before we continue, take a second to like, share, and subscribe, because this story isn't just about what happened. It's about what comes next. David barely looked up as Malik approached. His phone screen was flooded with news headlines, social media posts, and video shares. The footage of Officer Grant shooting Duke had gone viral overnight. Celebrities were reposting it. Activists were calling for action. The department was in crisis mode. David finally exhaled, glancing at his son. It's happening, he said. Malik swallowed hard. What do you mean? David turned the screen toward him. The local news was broadcasting a live press conference. Commissioner Douglas stood behind a podium, flanked by the mayor and the chief of police. His expression was grave, his hands gripping the edges of the podium. This department has reviewed the footage of Officer Grant's actions, the commissioner said, his voice carefully measured. And let me be absolutely clear, what happened was unacceptable. Malik's chest tightened. He didn't dare blink. Effective immediately, Officer Grant has been terminated, Douglas continued. An independent investigation is underway to determine if criminal charges are warranted. Furthermore, we are launching a full review of our policies regarding the use of force, including how officers are trained to respond to civilian encounters. The reporters erupted with questions. The commissioner lifted a hand, silencing them. This is not just about one officer. This is about trust. Trust that has been broken and must be rebuilt. David turned the volume down and met his son's gaze. This isn't just about Duke anymore, he said quietly. This is about something bigger. And they know it. Malik sat down, his hands trembling. It still hurt. Losing Duke, hearing that gunshot echo in his head. But for the first time since it happened, he felt something shift inside him. Justice wasn't just a word. It was something real. Something possible. A knock at the door interrupted them. David stood up, walking over. When he opened it, a woman in a dark blazer stood there, her expression serious. "Agent Washington?" she asked. David nodded. "I'm Ada Martinez with the District Attorney's Office," she said. "We need to talk about Officer Grant." David held her gaze for a moment, then stepped aside, letting her in. Malik watched as they moved toward the table. He didn't know what would happen next, but he knew one thing for sure. His father wasn't going to let this go, and neither was he. Duke wasn't coming back. But his story wouldn't be forgotten, and neither would the truth.